So I want to talk about the dark triad, as Lydia said, and I'm going to try to give you an overview of the dark triad first, and I'm also going to give you some information about some new findings that we have, as well as talk about two studies that have been published in the last few years about how the dark triad traits might differ from country to country, which might give us some insights about what are the conditions that might generate these kinds of responses to the world, a narcissistic response to the world, for example. So the dark triad are psychopathy, which is composed of antisocial personality traits, impulsivity, limited empathy, and this is a trait that's fairly well understood, I believe. I think most people know about it. If you didn't learn about it in school, you surely learned about it in some TV show or some movie, CSI or Criminal Minds or one of these kinds of TV shows. Indeed, I think Criminal Minds, which is a show in America, which you may or may not be aware of it, the dark triad has even been mentioned, for example, on this. And so there's quite a bit of popularity about this triad, we'll call it. The second part of the triad is called narcissism, and again, another trait that's been well researched. Like psychopathy, the majority of the research is focused on, or traditionally has been focused on, the clinical aspects and the clinical repercussions, and so the negative sides of narcissism and what are the bad things in people's life that might create a narcissist. But a narcissist, or someone who's high on narcissism, is someone who seeks admiration. It tends to be very likes to show off, for example. They need admiration, and they engage in what we call braggadocious behaviors, and that's just like chest beating, essentially, right? It's like, hey, look at me, I'm great. And so we have politicians in our daily news feeds on Facebook that, of course, demonstrate this kind of narcissism of this, hey, everyone, look at me. But this is not just for politicians. You see it in Instagram and Instagram models, and so there is this clear tendency for narcissistic people to try to seek attention, to get attention from other people. And lastly, and I think the trait that, from my experience, people know the least is Machiavellianism. Of course, this comes from Italian politics, and obviously I'm in Italy now, so I've had my experiences with Machiavellian behavior, if I'm honest. But the trait itself often is composed of aspects of being manipulative, trying to take advantage of people, having a very cold, pragmatic approach to the world, a very utilitarian set of moral principles. And so it's about getting things done and not worrying about, for instance, people's feelings or other things like that. And lastly, cynicism is another trait that's often ascribed to Machiavellianism. And ultimately, this is about thinking poorly of other people, as well as kind of having a relatively negative outlook on the world. And we call these, as a field, we call these the dark triad traits. And so this was a collection created by a guy named Del Paulhaus back in 2002, and it has taken off by any means. It doesn't mean there's only 3 dark traits, for example, but Paulhaus was simply pointing out that these 3 traits seem to share meaningful variance, they correlate well together, but they also seem to have very similar outcomes in the world in terms of both the social and, say, the political realms. And so, like I mentioned, this is quite popular, and this was something that I created back in 2011 just to show the incredible increase that we've experienced since 2002. So, of course, before 2002, no one talked about the dark triad really at all. Maybe some talks that somebody might have given, that Del Paulhaus might have given, for instance. And it kind of nothing really happens for a little while. So 2002, we finally see some hints of the dark triad, and then a couple of papers come out in 2005 and 2007. So there's a Hexaco paper. So Hexaco is the extended model of the Big Five, which also includes honesty and humility. And so there's a paper in 2005 that does that. And then there's one in 2006 that looks at the big five again. And then in 2007, there's another one in about behavioral genetics. And then in 2008, something happens. And what happens is I go to a conference in Japan and I use this guy as a metaphor to help people understand what I mean by the dark triad traits, but not from a clinical perspective, right? So not from the assumption that everything about psychopathy is bad and undesirable in a pathology, and not everything about narcissism is, etc., all that type of stuff. And so I got flooded with media attention, and I realized, hey, wait, maybe I should do some more work on this. And this was for our field, really the watershed moment that led to an incredible increase in popularity. Now, of course, I've adopted other metaphors to help people understand, some more funny than others. This is Bender, of course, from a cartoon, and he embodies the dark triad traits just like James Bond does. But all this coming together of popular appeal and research insights has led to what you'll see here is just an incredible increase. So notice how this figure ends at 2011, and I'd like to show you something we created just a few months ago. So we did a bibliometric analysis recently, and it's under review now, so fingers crossed and all that type of stuff. But you'll notice that 2011 is all the way down here. Now it's an incredibly rich field. It's constantly bringing in new people to research because it's newish enough that you can take anything you're interested in and basically throw it at the dark triad to study it. And that's not maybe the best way to do science, but certainly it's the good way to get lots of publications. So we see this incredible increase, and I don't want to say it's only because of this popularity, the James Bond approach or anything like that. There's more to it than that, of course. But I'm just trying to make the case that this is a field that is exponentially growing in interest. For example, in this bibliometric analysis, we found that we were able to look at the increase in interest, the slopes of interest. And the slope that seems to be the most interesting to people, the one that's getting the most interest over time in a geometric function, is the organizational psychology context. And so in the workplace, this kind of being a toxic employee and having a boss that's a jerk and all this type of stuff, absenteeism, no surprise, the money behind these kinds of things has motivated an incredible amount of research in the organizational domain. Most of my research has been in the interpersonal domain. Besides this dark triad research, I'm also a relationship researcher, so most of my thinking ties the dark triad to relationships, but that's a field that our findings suggest is still interesting to people, but it has much more of a steady increase. Organizational psychology seems to be where it's at if you wanted to go to jump on the proverbial bandwagon here. And so in this bibliometric analysis, we did this essentially this cluster chart, and thinking that we were going to be on the big screen, mistakenly, I'm sorry for thinking we're on the big screen. I'll just give you some insights here. So what we are detecting is a series of clusters in research traditions here in the dark triad, and that's of all the references since 2002. And we have over here in the red, we have, not to blow my own horn, but essentially my research, right? And so this is the evolutionary psychology aspect and studies that are informed by evolutionary psychology. So you have mating strategies down here, you have sex differences over here, for example. In this darker green, you have the kind of traditional externalization issues that are associated. So you have aggressive behavior, you have cyberbullying, you have Facebook. So the bad things that these traits lead to. Over here, you have in the middle, you have something more of a, what are the intrapersonal implications? So low empathy, disorders, emotional intelligence, that type of stuff. And so these are areas that people are investing lots of time in. We have over here purple, which I can't see all that well because I'm old and I can't see things, but things like decision making, honesty, and so this is traditional psychology domains, not particularly about pathology, but just trying to understand the traits. And then finally over here, this big blue one, this is the organizational. This is where you get leadership and you get performance, for example. And so while people are researching the dark triad in a huge variety of ways, there seems to be about 4 or 5 main themes that people are pursuing. And we haven't yet broken apart, as you can see by this, we do connect fairly well to one another, but I can imagine in 20 years, these becoming relatively distinct fields. But I want to give you some more recent findings. It's very simple for anyone to go to my website and read one of my many papers, but I want to give you a sense of some of the more recent stuff that might be interesting to us and maybe timely given modern circumstances. So the first one, of course, is maybe the timeliest of all. Just 10 minutes ago, somebody was yelling at me for running in the hallway here at my apartment because I didn't have my mask on. And I was like, but I'm running. But they're like, but you're inside. And so in principle, my refusal to wear a mask might be because I'm high on narcissism. And that's what we found. We found in a study in Poland, actually, in Warsaw with Marcin Zająkowski. We found that the dark triad traits predict, let's call it a reluctance to wear masks and to follow restrictions. Another one we found, also out of some data from Poland, is that there's it predicts a negativity towards refugees in Poland. And in particular, it seems to predict it through a sense of competitiveness for, in particular for the dark triad. So people behind the dark triad seem to be competitive, and that competitiveness predicts anti-refugee attitudes. And we thought this was a particularly useful test because from what I've been told, there aren't many refugees, if any, in Poland. And so we have essentially a pure measure of bias towards refugees with almost no exposure to refugees, assuming my logic is correct. It's associated very recently with victimhood, and this is very important for a lot of the protests that we've seen both in Warsaw, but of course all over America. Lots of protests, and a tendency to see oneself as a victim is associated quite strongly, and by strongly I mean 0.4, 0.5, with the dark triad trait. So it's a tendency to see yourself as special, and therefore the things that people do wrong to me, oh, well, I'm a victim of this bad thing, my suffering is worth attention type of thinking. And so this is of course correlated with, for example, narcissism. Similar to our concerns of the day, the dark triad traits predict hoarding. So you may remember there was a big run in basically every grocery store in America to hoard toilet paper for some bizarre reason. And what we essentially found in this study, again, another study through out of Warsaw at Uxvard, I've been told to call it. I don't know what that means. I hope it doesn't mean something bad. That people high in the dark triad were more likely to hoard, and this was a function of their health beliefs. And it was people who didn't think there was anything that they could do. They thought the things that we were being asked to do, wearing masks, socially distancing, if people thought those things were to be ineffective, and people behind the dark triad saw measures as ineffective, they then also were more likely to hoard. We live now more than ever in a world online. Very few social interactions do we have anymore, and cyber stalking. So the tendency to monitor and invade romantic and sexual partners' privacy is correlated with the dark triad. And interestingly, it's more strongly correlated. It's more of an effect for women, and in the romantic or long-term context. So women who are high in the dark triad, Machiavellianism in particular, are likely to cyberstalk their romantic partners. As Dr. Barron and I have showed, psychopaths cheat on tests. Why am I putting this here? Not only to show off the work that Lydia does, but because I think this might, as Lydia and I have talked about, this might be a trick you can use to get your students to not cheat. Because I can't imagine people want to think that they're psychopaths, and so if you just drop that bomb somewhere, so to speak, in the test instructions, remember, psychopaths cheat. You know, Barron and Jonason, 2020, whatever the date is, maybe that'll decrease cheating. I don't know. I'm gonna give it. I'm already giving it a shot this year. I have no control group, no comparison group, but we'll see what happens. Anyways, and this is just a small collection, and admittedly a self-serving collection, because this is research that I'm involved with, of course. But it is, as I mentioned earlier, it is tremendous the amount of people doing research on the dark triad. So as an editor at different journals, I'm regularly receiving articles for submissions about the dark triad and this and the dark triad and that. And so if people here are interested in these things, I know someone who may be on is interested in, for instance, ghosting behavior in the romantic context. This is correlated with the dark triad traits. So there is an opportunity here to at least include this in the studies that you do and see how it might serve as a moderator or a mediator, and maybe add some extra oomph to your paper. And of course, given my involvement at University of Silesia, I'm happy to help. Okay. Oh, sorry, I forgot this last one. Conspiracy thinking is correlated with the dark triad as well, as in silly beliefs about the virus, silly beliefs about really anything. And this is where I get to talk about my grandmother, because my grandmother believes all kinds of crazy conspiracies, and she would never think of herself as someone high in the dark triad, but she has a sense of entitlement. She's always thought of herself as the smartest person in the room, even when I'm in the room, so how dare she believe these things? As a joke. And she is caught up in different conspiracies. So she said to me last week about the microchips in the vaccine, and I'm like, how did that is such an easily falsifiable thing to believe, Grandma. But she didn't process it that way. And nevertheless, the dark triad traits do seem to be correlated with a variety of different kinds of conspiratorial thinking. Okay, now moving on. Sorry. Now, in my view, the real popularity of the dark triad and why it's become so important has been our integration of these traits into one evolutionary paradigm in particular called life history theory. And it asserts that organisms are essentially facing two different Darwinian challenges. One is surviving and one is reproducing. And any effort invested in one is effort you can invest in another. So it's a very zero-sum approach to the world. And so any metabolic energy that I spend running from a predator is not metabolic energy I can spend on creating a beautiful plumage to attract potential mates, whether I'm a peacock or a peacock in the human sense, where wearing fancy clothes and these things, right? So somatic effort refers to the people's tendency or organisms' tendencies to devote resources to surviving, making to the next day, basically. Whereas reproductive effort is more about making babies and less so rearing babies as well. So mating and parenting effort. And these two things are often in conflict. And so when organisms face conflicts, they often have to make sacrifices. And the argument applying life history theory to personality is it's saying, yes, species differ. Like, for instance, the two on the left, the chimpanzee and the elephant, are considered slow life history strategists because they mature slowly, they have very few offspring, and they invest heavily in those offspring, whereas this poison arrow frog and these mice, they have a fast life history strategy. You can describe species that way, but within species, you may also be able to describe people in a sense as embodying different strategies in their lives based on the inputs they get from the world and the outcomes they want to pursue. What this does is allows us to move personality traits from being just descriptive adjectives to saying something more, that maybe extroversion or something akin to extroversion is an adaptive strategy. It leads to things. For example, a study that I was asked to review yesterday, and admittedly I said I wasn't going to review it, but I read the abstract, so I'll give you the abstract version. It suggests that extroversion, low levels of extroversion might be maladaptive because it undermines your ability to find relationships. And what they found was people low on extroversion were more likely to be single to be single for longer, and a variety of other outcomes like that. And so being single, of course, means you're unlikely to make babies and rear those babies because you're unable to attract a romantic partner, or a sexual partner at least, because you're, I'm not going to say shy, but you're introverted. You're not predisposed to seek out public situations where you could potentially meet a romantic partner. Now, obviously during COVID, it's very difficult because we're all on Teams and Skype and Zoom and things like that, but I think there is some logic to this gentleman's claim of research. So anyways, from my perspective, and of course I first laid this out in 2010, but there's been many studies since then that have dealt with this, that the dark triad traits might be psychological systems that enable fast life history strategies, enable people to engage in a variety of behaviors that are likely to lead to immediate outcomes and reproductive success at the loss of their somatic, the protection, the being healthy, and the not breaking bones, and the not getting shot, and these types of things. Just as a little bit of evidence here for one little second, indeed, people high in the dark triad not only have more sex partners, but they also have more offspring as well. And so both of these bits of evidence are consistent with the hypothesis that the dark triad traits might be enabling a fast life history strategy. But collectively, what I want to give you a brief overview of some of the findings that back up this claim, not just these two I've given you. And we published this already in 2019, a kind of review of this. And of course, there are sex differences in the dark triad, and life history theory predicts that men or males should be more likely to engage in fast life history strategies than women are because of the cost-benefit ratio of the risk-taking, whether it's sexual or physical. Okay, and so there is how did that get there? Sorry. Men tend to be higher in the dark triad than women, and this is a finding that's all over the world. As we'll see very soon, there are places where the sex difference is near zero, but there are no cases that I know in the world where women are higher, and by higher, of course, I mean statistically significantly higher than men are. Indeed, it's so assured that when students of mine make mistakes in their data analysis and they come to me and they said, oh, women were more narcissistic than men, I say, that's really unlikely. They're like, no, that's what I found. No, you probably did something wrong because nearly every other study does not conform to what you're saying. So anyways, more evidence to this point. When asked, do they want $100 now or $1,000 in a year, people high in the dark triad tended to choose the $100 option, as in they were seeking immediate rewards and weren't willing to wait because their life history strategy, if you will, was geared towards not expecting the future to be good. And so you might as well take the 100 now because you can't guarantee the future. It's essentially if you were living in a country where you couldn't trust that companies that you bought stuff from were going to be there in another year. And so you had to just take whatever you could get at that moment and not worry about, are you going to get a refund or are you going to get, these types of things. I've already mentioned this, so I won't belabor it. These are people who are much more interested in short-term mating and long-term mating. This, of course, I mean by things like casual sex, like one-night stands, booty call relationships, friends with benefits, as opposed to committed, stable, long-term, mutualistic relationships. They tend to manipulate people more than cooperate. Even when they appear to cooperate, they're actually cooperating for their own selfish ends. They're cooperating in a selfish way. Not to say that cooperation isn't evolutionarily selfish, of course, but in the sense that these are people who are self-serving, to use a more psychology term than a biology term. Maybe to pick on myself a little bit here, in terms of publications, you would think then a person who has a fast life history strategy should focus more on publishing quantity than quality articles. And so what they'll do is they'll produce lots of low-level papers, so they have huge numbers, but the impact factor for the rest of the world, and then that weird scoring system that you have in Poland, that point system, you would get more 75s, like in not PLOS, what is it? Frontiers, for example, which I think is 75 points, versus something like Journal of Personality, which I think is, it's one down. So it's at 100. It's like not the top, but the next down, I think. So you have lots of frontiers papers, and I say this as an editor of Frontiers, who has to have a meeting with them soon, but they all fixate on the just bang, bang, bang. I want lots of papers, and they don't think maybe long-term or strategically about how do I do a series of projects that I can put together and make a bigger impact. And maybe that's because these people they're cynical, and so you think, well, yeah, I'm going to put in all this effort for 5 or 6 years, and I'll submit to JPSP. And for those of you who aren't in social psychology, that's the top social psychology journal. And you do 5 studies, and they come back and they say, well, we want 5 more. And I'm not really exaggerating, because my mentor publishes mostly in JPSP, and I have many friends who do, and that they say this is the common outcome for journals like JPSP. You submit 5 experiments, and they come back and they say, yeah, but we need 3 more, or something like that. And it is almost absurd. 5 years later, your paper is published. And so if your tolerance for that kind of waiting, like let's say you need a promotion, right? You're trying to get a promotion in a couple of years. Maybe you can't wait 5 years for that one paper. And so you have to chip away a little bit and maybe only publish mid-level papers. These are people who are more interested in themselves than others. They value family low, they value friends low, and the manner by which they value friends and family is also informative, because they value them as a means to an end. And so friends, so for instance, women who are narcissistic have male friends who they perceive to be potential mates, so sexual or romantic partners, but also men who have resources and men who might be good protectors. So it's not about liking these guys. Oh, they're fun. Oh, I like Star Trek. He likes Star Trek. It's great. Right? It's more like as the Eddie Murphy line went, what have you done for me lately? Right? So it's about serving their needs. What can you do for me? And that's why I want you around, and as opposed to what I can do for you, or as John F. Kennedy would say, right? Or just simply enjoyment of people's company. These people are, if you haven't guessed it already, much more agentic than they are communal, and they engage much more in risk-taking than safety. And of course, the standard interpretation of many of these things is, well, these are what we all call pathologies. So not thinking long-term, engaging in casual sex, manipulating other people, having a quality over quantity approach, engaging in risk-taking. The common interpretation of this is simply, well, this is all just evidence of the pathological nature of the traits. And so the challenge here for an evolutionary psychologist is to say, yes, there are these downsides, but what are the upsides? One of those upsides we mentioned earlier is more partners, for example, more offspring. So, but there's a question that needs to be asked that hasn't been asked very well yet. There has been some studies that have tried, but they are generally not very broad, or they are very few, is the issue of context. And I don't mean context in the traditional social psychological sense of interacting with a person, or context about, say, the classroom versus workplace, that kind of context. I mean the context in a global sense, in a larger sense, about the world that we live in itself, the sea of information and ideas and values and kind of feedback from the world that we get. And so that's what I want to look at, but that's not been what mostly people have been studying. And so I have done some of this, and so admittedly, some of this stuff that I'm saying is maybe not getting us where we want to get. That suggests that unpredictable and harsh childhood conditions may be associated with being high on the dark triad. So the conditions that should turn on a fast life history approach should be harshness and unpredictability. And I apologize if my English is bad. I hope you can understand me. And so if you're living in a an environment that you can't predict tomorrow, it makes sense to be a jerk. It makes sense to be selfish in this case. But if things are stable, then there's a higher payoff for being a nice person, a calm person, all these types of things, one that cooperates with other people, because there's likely to be a reward down the line, even if you didn't get it today. But the unpredictability says, I should take what I can get now because I can't guarantee I can get it tomorrow. Indeed, similar evidence suggests that narcissism is linked to helicopter momming, and this helicopter momming might be a diagnostic feature of there are problems in the world. And so why might a mom be a helicopter mom? Because she perceives the world as dangerous, and therefore she treats her child in a different way. And it doesn't matter whether it is more dangerous or not, right? So we have lots of, anti-vaxxer California soccer moms who engage in helicoptering with the mistaken assumption that their lives are difficult and dangerous, but the result of this might actually be that it creates narcissism in their children because they're so trying to protect their child that it actually has a, if I can steal a term from psychological reactants, a boomerang effect, where the effort going this way comes back and actually bites you on the, on the bum. Okay. In addition, psychopathy in participants is associated with having an absent father. So having a father that wasn't around when they were a child seems to be one of these conditions that says life sucks, time to be a jerk. Now, it's of course possible that this psychopathic child might have driven his father away. That is, of course, a possibility. I think that's a less likely possibility, but the research on this is not, for instance, longitudinal. So it's people's reports of their psychopathy when they're college students or MTurk participants. I think this study, for instance, was college students in the UK, and their self-reports of having, how much was your father around, for example. They are, no surprise, they are associated with insecure attachment patterns, another one of these diagnostic features of difficult lives. So parents may be only able to offer insecure attachment to their children when they have to work 2 jobs, for example, or they're in a war-torn area. Similarly, the uncertainty in that attachment might set up a system of information processing heuristics in people's minds that lead them to engage in the behavior that we call psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. And lastly, in experimental situations, when people, this is not me here, of course, but when people threaten participants who are psychopathic, they react to that, they get more aggressive to that. When narcissists when their ego is threatened, they get more aggressive. And at least in this study, there was no response to that associated with Machiavellianism per se. Now, all this is great, but of course I much more consider myself a biologist than a psychologist. And so can I find some sorts of analogs to this in the animal kingdom? And indeed I can, and it comes from elephants. And now it's a bit of a stretch. I won't lie to that, but it is well known that the absence of bull male elephants, I should say bull elephants, leads to a kind of behavior in juvenile male elephants that we would describe as psychopathy. It's like bad teenage boy behavior. It's harassing the females, it's harassing the young, it's being aggressive, it's fighting, it's all these kinds of things. Now they don't have the sophistication of the cultural sophistication that we have, of course, but they seem to be engaging in a kind of behavior that is reminiscent of psychopathy. And so I don't think psychopathy is itself a real thing in people's brains. I think it's a way that we describe people's behaviors. And so I'm willing to stretch and say these are some behaviors in elephants that we would describe as psychopathic. So, but that's just my aside, and you can argue with me on that one, of course, and people probably will. Okay, so besides the ignoring of the issue of context, and not in the social psychological way of context, in the let's call it in the biologist way of context, is that most research has been weird. And by weird, if you're unfamiliar with this phrase, if your research is, for instance, maybe not as focused on these issues, weird is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So most research comes out of America, Canada, Germany, the UK, places like that, and you know, Poland is rising up there very quickly, of course. But if you went back and counted at this point, most research comes from, as you see, these kinds of places. So America, Canada, and the darker colors where you get most of the research, right? Where we have South Africa, Australia, of course. These are more westernized countries. They're more educated countries. They're more advanced, richer, and they likely to have some sort of democratic government. And so as you see right here, 68% of the studies that they counted in this particular analysis were from an American sample. So maybe Americans have more free time and more things are, or have been in the past, more stable, and so allowed for more time spent doing scientific inquiry. We've also traditionally invested a lot more money in these kinds of things, but nevertheless, this is probably changing given recent things. But a book was written on this issue by Joe Heinrich recently about the weirdness of psychology and how almost everything we know could be potentially biased if you assume that Americans are quantitatively different than people from Bolivia or Peru or you know, Fiji or something like that. I'm not sure if that's reasonable, but there are cultural rules that may influence and moderate and mediate the kinds of effects that we find. Nevertheless, there has been some research looking at the, let's call it the contextual effects of the dark triad, and this is a study that we published as a commentary in Brain and Behavioral Sciences. And all we did is we took the nation level rates of the dark triad, and we correlated them with the distance from the equator. And so countries that are closer to the equator would be ones like, of course, Brazil, but they have particular climates, and those climates lead to particular kind of cultural systems as well. And ones that are farther away, like say Finland, we have Finland up here, you know, and Finland over here as well, where it's colder. And when it's colder, that should create other sorts of cultural systems. And so in places like Finland and Norway, not to use the phrase from the movie, the TV show or the Netflix that I always use, winter is coming and you have to prepare for it. And that preparation over generations might not only change people, might change genes, but it surely changes the payoff ratios for engaging in different kinds of behaviors in different cultural contexts. Whereas in places like Florida or Brazil, what's the point? It's always nice here. It never snows here, right? But it gets cold in Warsaw, for example, get cold in Katowice, and so you have to be prepared for that stuff. You have to make houses that have insulation, right? So before I moved before I moved to Warsaw and then Italy, I lived in Australia, and Australians all believe that they live at the beach where it's really, really warm. And so they make houses really, really poorly because they can't imagine that in another 2 months, it's going to be really cold. And so every winter, people are in their parkas and they're complaining and they dress like it's -5 degrees when it's maybe 10, for example. Nevertheless, what we find here is that as you move away from the equator, people become less narcissistic. But as you move away from the equator, people also become more Machiavellian. Now, if you're curious where Poland is, here's where Poland is. Okay, and so this is just a country level correlation, right? So country level effects in the dark triad, and we'll get more into country level effects in a little while. But as a rule, there's been a general failure to examine this, and from my knowledge in this field, I think this paper, this 2017 paper, is the first time that anyone's tried to link country level indicators to anything about the dark triad. So moving on, and I'm totally going slow here, so my apologies for being behind. So let's burn through these studies if you may. There's a bit to cover, but We want to account then for what accounts for why some countries are more narcissistic than others. Maybe cultural factors are expressions of individual traits. And this would be a bottom-up process, that individuals who are more narcissistic make a more narcissistic society. Conversely, maybe, let's call it social justice-oriented people might put forth, that no, culture is the imposition. Culture, we are the victims of culture, and it's a top-down process, that culture forces us to be this way. Right? Culture is the predominant factor and force in the models of these people's psychological systems and why the world is the way it is. And then, of course, we will ask what accounts for variance in the sex differences. So the sex differences in Asian countries, for instance, tend to be not only small, but often not statistically significant. We're in places where most of the data had been collected, like America, like M-Turk samples, for example. You do find this sex difference. Men are more psychopathic, narcissistic, and Machiavellian than women are. So why might this exist? Is it possible that what's happening is that as societies become less patriarchal, right, the sexes will become more similar, that the sex differences will shrink because that those sex differences are an artifact of this cultural system. Conversely, our sex differences maybe our sex differences are being suppressed in more conservative places, and then when you get to more modernized liberal places, the sexes are free to be more different. There's less imposition from things like religion that says you should be this way and you should be this way, and so we would maybe find larger sex differences. It's also possible that in societies with more danger, there might be larger sex differences as well, because the need to be more, let's say, macho in more dangerous places might push people to be more narcissistic, for example. But it's also possible that women in more dangerous places need to be more narcissistic because they need to survive. And so maybe it's not men who are sensitive to these ecological differences, but maybe it's women who are sensitive to them. And when the world is great, women are freed to be less narcissistic. They don't have to be as agentic. They can be more communal. They can be nicer. But men continue to be the jerks that we know they all are, of course. Right? So we collected data from all these places. So obviously not around the world. We wish we could have had better coverages in places like Africa, of course, and this huge country over here, Greenland, we totally miss it, right? But nevertheless, we have a fair range of data from quite a few countries, over 50 countries, and it was part of the cross-cultural enhancement project run out of Oxford, and we collected data from over 12,000 people from all these different countries. There is a mean sample size of 230 people, but there was some range in that, of course, and as we moved down through this study, we only included countries that had at least 150. We didn't want to have particularly small samples, and there was some errors that we detected, of course, and we had to get rid of some groups, some countries, because there was major mistakes. But pretty much a standard college student sample. We have a 66% female, and we mostly try to do it online, but in some places that they couldn't do it, it was done in paper and pencil, or maybe paper and pen, who knows. We used my measure of the dark triad, the dirty dozen. This was forward translated and back translated, and if you're interested in using one of these translations, I created a Dropbox file that's available through my website, peterjonason.com, where you can get the various translations. I think and I don't mean to make a joke about this, there are dozens of translations available, so Malay and Japanese and a variety of other languages. So if you're interested in this, and of course, actually I think the second language it was translated into was Polish by Anna Chana. And so it's a very straightforward test, 4 items per scale. Some of this low internal consistency was some of these bad countries. Like, for instance, something was really weird about Brazil, and so Brazil is responsible for this 0.52. If you take that out, the bottom end shifts up quite a bit. This is a typo here. I'm sorry. This should be 0.6. These are the low ones. I think we go up as high as 0.85 at least. And we find some congruence in the measurement, and so we can trust comparing from country to country as well. Okay, so we included country level factors. I'm going to burn through these quickly because of course I'm talking too much, as I told Lydia I would. Things like global peace index, gender gap, corruption, HDMI, and the truth is there are hundreds of potential country level indicators, and at some point you just have to choose some. And so we just chose, and we moved forward, and we encourage future researchers to take their pet country level indicators and throw our data at them if they're interested. And so this is a big sea of numbers, and I'll make it easy for you. The most important things I'll highlight in red like this. And what we find is that narcissism, more than Machiavellianism and psychopathy, but a little bit with Machiavellianism, narcissism seems to be particularly sensitive to country level indicators. And so in places that are worse, there's higher narcissism. So less development, higher narcissism. So that the nation level of narcissism, the national level of narcissism is higher in countries that have lower HDMI, that have lower freedom from corruption, that have lower economic freedom, that have lower democracy, and have less peace, and have less gender inequality, for example. In terms of the sex differences, the effects are also particularly localized only to narcissism. Obviously, you see there are sporadic effects with psychopathy, as you see here, and with Machiavellianism, but the majority of the effects seem to be about narcissism, and it suggests to me that narcissism may be more sensitive than these other traits for reasons that we can't get into. And so it suggests, though, that in contrast to what we'll call the socio-cultural or the feminist argument about sex differences, that they are artifacts of the patriarchal system of that when societies are more free and safer and less dominated by men and women should be more similar. We find the exact opposite of that, and that as societies become more, for example, as they hold more egalitarian values here, the sex differences get larger. And that's in direct opposition to, so we've falsified, I think, in some regard, this sociocultural argument about sex differences, and we've upheld a kind of more evolutionary argument for it. Now, of course, there are sex differences, as you can imagine, and these are rather moderate across the world, but there's a fair degree of variance in that. And so we of course wanted to know also, where is that, who's changing? Is it men or is it women? And what we found was in total was that worse places seem to be associated with more narcissism, and this may be because there's a greater need to be competitive and to survive. And with Machiavellianism and psychopathy, remember there are fewer correlations, but there seems to be something going on about the more complex the society, the more duplicitous people have to be, and we could maybe make an argument about American politics in this regard. But the interesting part for me is that the sex differences suggest that when the world is nicer, when the country is nicer, there are larger sex differences, and here's the drum roll please, it appears that it's women who are making the change. So men seem to be continually their narcissism seems to be insensitive to these country level indicators. It's women who seem to change. And so while men stay, here in their narcissism, in more dangerous places, it's women who are rising up to meet the man's narcissism. And we think this is because in those places, things are crappy. And then narcissism has a greater payoff now for women than it does for women in places that are nicer, like Australia, for example, which we'll get to in just a minute. So I tried to run through this as quickly as possible. This is the publication. You're welcome to read this. There's many more authors to this and to get more sense of this. And I'm very sorry for being so slow. Okay, that's great. We've now done the first study looking at cross-cultural variance, but there's some problems with it. So we did another study here, and this is admittedly published before, but we started it after because international projects take quite a long time. But it's limited because it was exploratory in that we we had to just pick some cross-cultural indicators. We used my measure of the dark triad, which some would call as bad, and we didn't examine any mechanisms. So what's going on in people's minds, potentially, that might lead them to make these changes? So we did a natural groups design where we collected data in Australia and Turkey. And just some background, I don't think you have any doubts about how dangerous things are in Australia. Sorry, in Turkey, for example. It's notable on the news. But just 2 years ago, Australia was rated the safest country in the world for women, as an example. And so it's a very safe place. This is, of course, the country I left. And so we sampled 217 men, 339 women. This is through translations. And this is one of my favorite pictures of Turkey, and I found this before I ever presented on this data before. This is a protest for gay rights, where the police were using hoses to spray people down, and while they do that, a rainbow happens. So I think this is ironic at the very least, but clearly these kind of protests are happening all over, but they're getting pretty rough in Turkey. And so this kind of, it's not really quasi-experimental, it's really, as I said, natural groups design, but we collected data on the dark triad using another measure. We collected beliefs as some of the systems in people's heads that might be responsible. Beliefs in the world being dangerous and the world being competitive. And so here's some stuff, right? So is Turkey darker, right? Is it more dangerous? All those kinds of things. Well, indeed it is. It's more characterized by the dark triad, and it's more characterized than Australia by believing the world is dangerous and believing the world is competitive. In addition, there are, of course, no surprise, sex differences. We replicate sex differences in the dark triad, and men saw the world as more competitive. As one of my former mentors said, men see the world through competition-colored glasses. Right? Everything is a competition, and that's essentially what we're seeing here. Now, in terms of looking at the sex by country interaction, we find that men in Turkey are more narcissistic than men in Australia. We also find that women in Australia are less narcissistic than women in Turkey. So both effects are significant, but the effect is weaker in men. And importantly, the effect is women are becoming less narcissistic in nicer places. So the effect is driven mostly by Australian women being particularly low on narcissism. Okay. So again, we get this niceness leads to larger differences. That's this larger difference right here and right there. Okay. So the beliefs around the world are associated with the dark triad. So they're associated with believing the world is competitive, but they're also associated with believing the world is dangerous. However, as you can tell just by looking at the correlations are 2 to 4 times, 2 to 4? Yeah, 5 times larger in competitive than dangerous world beliefs. So people behind the dark triad really see the world in competitive terms much more than they can see it in dangerous terms. Maybe no surprise, because they tend to often have, especially with psychopathy, there's a fearless dominance aspect to psychopathy. Okay, so now can we look at the mediation effects of country? What might account for the differences in country in each of the traits? And we find that with competitive views only, when we add in competitive worldviews as a mediator, the correlations shrink in all cases. And we looked at them in both sexes, and they're partial in both sexes. So we have a decrease in the magnitude of the correlation, suggesting that there's some mediation going on here. We do the same thing, but we flip it around and we say, okay, well, what about sex differences now? Maybe the sex differences are a function of competitive worldviews, and indeed they are. Right? And so again, the betas, these are betas here. Sorry, I forgot to say that. The betas get smaller for sex when we add, for each of the traits, when we add in competitive worldviews. And so it suggests that the mechanism that connects the dark triad to, that creates sex differences might be competitive worldviews. Okay. So in general, I'd like to say that I think that the dark triad are condition-dependent adaptations to deal with sociological stress, like cultural stress, like danger, like war, these kinds of things. Arguably, being able to respond to local conditions would make people better able and better suited to exploit the situations at hand, to get the most out of the environment. An alternative view would say that the dark triad traits are fixed alternative strategies. If they were, that these would be potentially maladaptive in my view, because they would be insensitive to inputs. And so we have to calibrate. So we think of psychopathy as a typology. Oh, you're a psychopath. But my argument is that these are strategies that people adopt in response to conditions informed by their kind of genetic dispositions, if you will. And each trait, in particular, we show narcissism may be sensitive to its own particular inputs for these kinds of things. And so these traits then might simply be the expressions of biases that enable people to extract what they want from the world. Now, this is, of course, the first large-scale assessment. Narcissism was mostly where the action is. This is in both studies, in study 1 and study 2. Narcissism seems to be the hub of these effects. Harsher places seem to have more narcissistic populations. Harsher places seem to encourage women to be narcissistic as what we'll call an insurance policy of the potential that their husbands and lovers might die, as well as their own mortality threats that they've faced. Machiavellianism seems to be less sensitive to cultural variance, but it seems to be stronger in more advanced places, so places like America. And maybe Trump is a good example of this, that we have an advanced country with a leader who has now risen to power and clearly being Machiavellian. So in this case, I mean Machiavellian in the way Steven Pinker would call veiled commands. So he didn't say, hey, go and protest and storm the Capitol. But there's good reason to believe that his followers, so to speak, knew what he was getting at. And this is so he doesn't have to say it, so he's not culpable, but people know what he means. And this is a very Machiavellian, duplicitous kind of tactic. And I'm not taking a stand whether I like him or don't like him. I'm just pointing out the effects. Study 2, we just went over it. Obviously, we talked about Turkey being darker. They saw the world as more dangerous and competitive, and men were high in the dark triad traits, also saw the world as more competitive, and women seem to be, again, the hub of the shift in cross-cultural variance. All right, almost done, I promise. 2 more slides. Obviously, we have mostly student and volunteer samples here. Sample 1, we had some sample size problems. Even 150 is probably a little bit too light. Modern standards in personality psychology suggest that 250 is really what you want, but when we have countries like Mali in Africa, and they only could get 150 people, it's a bit like, but we got 150 people from Mali, and so we include it, and you can criticize as you will. Of course, this is cross-sectional. We collected in study 1, for example, data from 2016 and country-level data from 2016. And so down here to this limitations that I mentioned here, one of my students now is going to collect data from say 2010 and then 2000, some years before, and we'll look at the patterns over time potentially. And we only use the dark triad. We didn't include the tetrad or what is growing to be a crayon Crayola box of colors of darkness. And I can, in questions maybe I can talk about why I'm dubious about the expansion from the tetrad from the triad to the tetrad if somebody's curious. We didn't look at the aspects of each trait because because of the measures we used don't allow for that. So narcissism is composed of multiple components. We couldn't look at that in this particular study. But in conclusion, it seems like the dark triad traits are sensitive to environmental variance. There are societal conditions and values that seem to be linked to the dark triads in 2 different studies about competition in particular. And in closing, for 5 minutes late, sorry, when times get tough, maybe people are nudged to adopt dark behavioral syndromes, the dark triad, for example, not calling it a trait, but calling it a behavioral syndrome to extract what they need from the world. Thank you.